Hi, and welcome back to the second part of the presentation on finding your patriots in the 1800s, a presentation for the Wichita Genealogical Society. Let's get going. We're going to apply those records that we discussed in the first part to a specific individual that I did some research on. His name was Hiram McDonald. He was born in 1842 in New York, and he died in 1902. And what we're going to do is take a look at the records that I was able to find prior to looking at his military, and then look at the walls that were broken down by dipping into his military records, specifically his pension. So here's the basic timeline on Hiram. He was born in New York in 1842. I know that he was a shoemaker along most of his life. He lived in southeastern Kansas, was potentially married, don't know when, to a lady named Ada with no known last name, had at least one son by her with a first name that began with A. Adopted a son named Frank. Looks like he was remarried in about 1884, 83, because he shows up as married to Nanny J with the last name possibly of Gleason, and had two more sons, Roy and Holly Don, before dying in December 1902, again in southeastern Kansas. So the first record, we see pension index file card for Hiram McDonald. The citation for this is on the right. We're going to step through little pieces of this to show what does it tell us about Hiram. Well, first off, we know that his widow was named Nanny, and he had a minor child at the time he died who had a guardian. That's the GDN that's listed there on the right-hand side of that box. And very likely, possibly, Nanny Lamb was his second wife who would have remarried after his death. We can also tell that he served in two different regiments, the New York Cavalry, the 6th Regiment, and the 2nd Regiment of the New York Provisional Cavalry, both in Company A. And then in the list of filings associated with pensions, there's 3 different pensions. As a disabled veteran, his widow had a pension and so did his minor child. We can tell that each one was approved as you have an application and a certificate number for each. And we can also see that on the far right side of that box that they were all living in Kansas when they filed. Taking a closer look at that little left-hand box, it appears that Hiram first applied for his pension in 1883. That would have been shortly after it was available. His widow applied in 1903, so we know that he died before 1902, before 1903, which fits with what we know about Hiram, and that his minor had a filing in what may be 1903 or 1908. Whether that is associated with a significant birthday of the minor or the beginning of a pension, we don't know. Additionally, when you take a look at a person who has multiple pensions associated with the service, you will see a combined file folder, and that is the number at the bottom here, XC2817724. That is the number you need when you discuss things with either the National Archives or service who works with them. The record that I looked for associated with Hiram, I asked about it first in Washington, D.C. before getting turned down, and they told me to check with St. Louis, and once I did, it took just a couple weeks before I received a scanned image of his pension file. We'll get to that in a second. After the index card, I turn to the state adjutant general records. As we discussed, those are kept at the state level. They are generally has to do with registration of soldiers or discharge information, looking at the readiness of the state from a military perspective. Here's Hiram. He is, again, you can see he's in the 6th Regiment in New York Cavalry. He was a private in Company A. That is consistent with what we knew about him before, but there's additional information on here that is really very valuable, including his condition that was associated with possibly his pension, the pension amount, and the location of his affiliation with a Grand Army of the Republic post. This is in El Dorado, and he lives in the Toronto, Kansas area. Again, still in southeast Kansas. Those into consideration, you say, man, I've got a 1-for-1 match between this gentleman and the one that was represented on the index card. You don't stop there, because here is another Hiram McDonald. This also born in New York. He was in the infantry, though, not the cavalry, in a different regiment, in a different rank as a musician. And honestly, what really ties it together and makes me question things is when you look at his disability. He was discharged for deafness, which is the same disability that was listed in the previous AG record. So the question is, are they the same person? And that's where we're going next. Because we look at the state AG record for the state of New York. Here's Hiram McDonald again. At the top, you can see that it lists his service in Company A in the 6th Regiment, in the same company in the 2nd Provisional Cavalry. But what's interesting in this is that it points to his status as a veteran, and that he originally enlisted in 1862 at Schenectady, New York. And it says, see the 134th Infantry for Hiram C. McDonald. And now we know that this is very, very likely the same individual that we saw listed in the cavalry units starting in 1864. Next step was to order his compiled military service records. And as opposed to just looking at his pension index when there would have been 2 folders of his information, I now have 3 that I'm pulling associated with his time out of the Schenectady unit, as well as his time in the 2 cavalry units. So I ordered those in. These are copies of the images of the folder. Within each folder, if I combine the 3 of them together, I had over 12 muster roll records, 2 descriptive book entries, mustering in and out rolls, including returns, and amazingly, his enlistment papers from the 2nd time he was when he enlisted in the cavalry, and the recruiting papers associated with that showed the name of his recruiter, the bonus that the recruiter was paid, and especially a sworn statement from Hiram stating that he was honorably discharged from his prior service. So now that you have 20-odd records associated with Hiram's service, what do you do with it? Well, you abstract it and you create a timeline of this short time frame between 1862 and 1865. When you do that, you pull those records, it becomes obvious why Hiram included some information in his pension application and other information wasn't in there. He mustered in 1862, but 1863 he deserted in January. He was captured and returned, went through court-martial, and it ended up with him being drummed out of the Army in March of 1863, and he was literally drummed out. By 1864, we find him back in New York, where he is re-enlisted in the cavalry, those units that were listed on his pension, and he served to the end of the war. When pulling his regimental history for the 134th, his time as a musician, I was incredibly lucky. Within that document was actually a lot of information specifically about Hiram and his court-martial. The only court-martial that was discussed within the entire book. And it had some interesting pieces about him. He was a drummer. He returned to the ranks as a private because the company commander didn't like his musical skills. Hiram's defense at his trial was that he was nearly deaf, and they knew it at the time he enlisted, and therefore he shouldn't be held accountable for the fact that he was already deaf. This becomes a really key point when you take a look at his pension, because he lists his deafness due to the war as part of the basis for his pension. So he got it both ways there, it seemed like. The unit he was in, and it helps to put it in perspective, participated in multiple battles, some of them just shortly after he deserted, including Chancellorsville in May and Gettysburg in July of 1864. So there were a lot of opportunities that for battle and exposure to potential death and disease that Hiram missed because he left and was drummed out in March 1863. So the pension file. Now I haven't included the images here of elements because unfortunately I have lost the 199 images that was sent to me from the National Archives. The good news is I had taken and written down, summarized pretty much the entire contents, so I was able to refer back to my notes in listing the information. Lots of walls got broken through when it came to Hiram because of his pension. I found out that he was born in Schenectady, New York, and died of tuberculosis. Because I know now that he was born in Schenectady, I was able to go back and find his father and his many siblings and to move back another generation. The pension file also told me where he went directly after the war. He moved to Ohio and lived with his brother Anson, who was also a veteran, and then they both moved to Kansas following that. I now have the name of his first wife, including her surname. I know when they were married and when she died. I now know about his second wife, Nanny Gleason, when they were married and when she was born. And then I have a record there, in fact, a marriage certificate of Nanny when she married Olson Lamb. And if you recall, Nanny Lamb was the guardian to Hiram's minor child. And then even unusually, the file included information about Olson, Nanny's second husband, about where Olson was born, where his father died, who was also a Union soldier at Murfreesboro. So there were multiple walls broken down, taking a look at the pension file, which isn't necessarily cheap, but looking at the pension file gave me all kinds of additional information on this. A bonus that I didn't really talk about because it's pretty rare to find was I also ordered his court-martial transcript directly from the National Archives. And all I've done here on this slide is I have transcribed the information on the far right that talks about how they knew that he was deaf when he was recruited, and that being a drummer would not make a difference. So you can go through and put that all together, but you're not done till the paperwork's finished. There's nothing like taking the information you have here and creating a special side report on your ancestor or the person you're doing research on that looks at their activity during this relatively short period of time. There's so many records we have in this piece of it. One of the things that you will find as you take a look at this, and I've mentioned it before, that the information in the pension file can scan decades. In the case of Hiram, it started in 1883 and did not end until 1947. So here you've got 60 years of family history as individuals changed and addresses changed and testimony came into the file. It's all in that pension file. Once you put that all together, which I did in a research report, you can, I make the observation that Hiram probably survived the war partly because he deserted when he did. With his deafness, it was a real disability to hearing instruction. He left just prior to and returned after two of the major conflicts with the highest mortality rates, and a good third of his regiment was gone, or his original regiment was gone by the end of the war. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation or the applied knowledge towards Hiram and getting a viewpoint into his life. Thank you for watching this. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to send an email. And again, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.